Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Large Projects Full Proposal webinar for the ARPA Nonprofit Capital Project Fund. I did want to give you the heads up that we will be recording today's meeting in case someone needs to view it afterwards. So if you would not like to be recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. But if you do feel comfortable, we'd love to see your face. So whatever is best for you guys. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get the presentation started. A little bit of Zoom housekeeping rules. We do have you guys on mute right now. And as we go over the application and the techniques and tips, we ask you to put your questions in the chat. And then when we go into the Q&A portion after our walkthrough, we'll go through all the questions and give you the best available answer. And then if there's follow-up, we will make sure that we get that clarity to you. And I will now go into introductions of the PCF staff that's been right alongside you throughout this grant process. I don't believe Duggan is on just yet.
No, he'll be joining us soon.
Okay, so I will kick it off first to Jocelyn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jocelyn Howard. I am the Senior Program Officer for ARPA.
Awesome. And you guys know me. My name is Rose Cervantes, and I am the Program Officer for ARPA. And next we have David.
Hi, everyone. David Bender, Director of Grants and Operations here at PCF.
Awesome. Dr. Reed. You're on mute. Oh, maybe she can't unmute herself.
Thank you. I wasn't able to unmute, but good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to see you here. I am working with the PCF team as the evaluator of the process.
Awesome. And then we have Nikki Gaskin Capehart.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nikki Gaskin Capehart, and I'm working with Dr. Reed and the team. Thank you.
Awesome. And then we have our wonderful CEO, Duggan, who will be joining us shortly. Okay, so again, thank you so much for being here today and being a part of this process. If you're in this room, that means you've successfully made it through the letter of intent stage for the large capital projects grant route. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about what comes next in this process timeline. We'll walk through the application and the grant portal and some of the expectations from the committee perspective, but also from our staff. And then we'll talk a little bit about the post-award details and then open up the room for any questions you may have. And then up next, Jocelyn will tell us a little bit more about timeline.
So this should probably be familiar to everyone, starting with the letter of intent, which you submitted in early September. We're here between the invitation to submit a full application and the deadline, which is December 9th. Committee will be reviewing your applications and making funding recommendations in January. And then just as a reminder, the Board of County Commission has the final say on these funding recommendations, and that will come in February. Contracting will begin at the end of the month in March. In terms of expectations for your application, we will be going over the full application in depth, so I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but just a reminder that for any projects that are requesting $1 million or more, you will have to provide a little bit of extra evidence to support your application. And specifically, we will be wanting to see why the existing infrastructure that you have isn't enough to remedy the harm from COVID that you have outlined in your application. And we'll be asking you for 2 alternative hypothetical capital projects and why what you're proposing is better than those options. This is something that's required by the Treasury, and David will be going over that a little bit more as we move through the application review. The second bullet point in terms of permits, a plan set, which is architectural drawings and other documentation, a timeline for your project, bids. We'll be going through all of that as well. These are things that you have also seen if you've opened the application. So we'll be going through that in detail.
And up next, David.
So we'll be going into the grant portal in just a second, which is my second home at this point. You might remember from in our original webinar, you don't have to, I'm going over it again for this reason. We used an example of a mental health agency called Better Tomorrow, that's whose mission is to provide stigma-free, high-quality mental health care throughout Pinellas County, especially in underserved areas. The hypothetical negative economic impact we have for this organization is that inflation has increased staffing costs by 20% since 2020. Staff turnover has increased and service demand has increased. All of these are affecting Better Tomorrow's economic situation negatively. The proposed project that they are doing is an expansion to their counseling center. So expansion and renovations and the amount of $2 million. So I'm going to be using this example throughout the full application, kind of saying what we'd like to see from Better Tomorrow. I will say a lot, if you've looked in the grant portal, you'll see a lot has been copied over from your letter of intent. The majority of those questions can be changed. I'm not going to be going over them. What I will say about changing that content is you should not be changing the nature of your request. Do not change what you're asking for. Get in touch with us first to see if that is allowable. In many cases, it won't be. If it's slight tweaks, maybe, but in most cases, you can't change what you're asking for because of the letter of intent process and that you were moved forward based upon what you're originally asking for. So when I go over the grant portal, I will be skipping over those copied over questions with some exceptions. So here we are. There is a Word version available with the disclosure that what is on the grant portal takes precedence. We're trying to keep the Word. We are not making major tweaks to the application. We wouldn't do so without letting you know first. But if there's minor changes, the grant portal version takes precedence. We will be updating the Word document today, just to match the grant portal as exactly as possible. So again, the beginning of the application is basic info that you've already filled out. We don't think your mission has probably changed in the month since this has been reviewed, so we've locked that field. The unique entity ID, again, you have to get this with sam.gov. It is not required to submit, but you should get started on it if you are moved to the contracting phase. So by March, we'll need this to issue a contract. Your annual operating budget size, we've locked, and it's been copied from your letter of intent. Amount requested. For some reason, we cannot lock this field, but you should not change this without getting in touch with, unless you've gotten in touch with Rose first. The letter of intent committee took into consideration how much being requested was moved forward, and if that suddenly inflates, that changes again the core nature of your request that you've submitted. And this total project amount exceeding the amount your organization is requesting is locked, and you've already answered the question related to that if you've answered yes. So don't worry about that. Request specifics, programming background and community need, copied from your letter of intent. If you want to sharpen it, I would say with more numbers for community need, that would help you. Negative economic impact. If you want to sharpen this with more numbers or more concrete evidence of how you've been negatively impacted by the pandemic. We can also allow uploads. So if you have information about canceled fundraisers, budgets showing changes in budgets in certain line items, or evidence of donations that never happened, which it's hard to sometimes say, well, we don't know the donations we didn't get. But if you can estimate changes in patterns and can upload that, that'd be great. Pandemic relief funding. So this is a question that wasn't on the letter of intent. This is about any pandemic relief funding you've gotten, whether it's been from, and it has to be from a government source. So for example, PCF ran the Pinellas Cares Nonprofit Partnership Fund. If your organization received a grant from that, you would describe it there. Any other ARPA funding, there were many ARPA reached its tentacles throughout the entire economy. So if you got it through another stream, disclose it here. The Paycheck Protection Program or CBDG funds. And you have to also describe why this was not sufficient in alleviating the negative harm you just described above. So for example, with the Pinellas Cares Nonprofit Partnership Fund, PCF will know this, but a committee member not, you might have gotten $700,000 from that, and it had an expiration date. So, if you didn't spend it, it's gone. If you did spend it, it's also gone. So that harm might still be persisting. If you haven't received anything from the government in terms of pandemic relief, you would just state that. But this is a required question because we want to make sure no one skips it. So you do have to fill in something here. The proposal description, again, you can sharpen this. You cannot change the nature of your request. So if you have especially more information about how it resolves the negative economic harm, you can sharpen your response to it. But again, don't go from we're expanding a building to we're actually just building a sign outside. Don't. Number served and unduplicated versus duplicated, we've locked these fields. If something has significantly changed, please get in contact with Rose and we'll make a determination of whether we'll allow it to be changed or not. Rent versus own is also locked. That shouldn't have changed either. Guiding principles for client impact. So we've talked about the importance of equity in terms of ARPA was passed with an equity framework in mind. There was an executive order around it as well. So we use this definition. If you want to give more explanation around geography, this is also a place where maybe later on we talk about QCTs, but here you could talk about other geographies that you serve that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Dr. Reed, do you want to add anything here about how they could sharpen it, perhaps?
Yeah, I would just say, keep in mind that QCTs are one way you could have shown disproportionate impact. It's not the only way. If you can demonstrate disproportionate impact to groups of people, whether by race, ethnicity, any social status, or by economic status, as well as by geography, disproportionate impact in terms of geography around Pinellas County, this is the place to do that. So don't limit how you describe disproportionate impact, because you will earn a few more points if you can demonstrate that you're serving a population that's experienced a disproportionate impact from COVID.
Thank you. Organizational sustainability. So this is asking, how does this purchase contribute to the long-term sustainability of your organization and the work it does? So for example, in the example of Better Tomorrow, the expansion of the counseling center, that will allow them to serve maybe 20 more clients per week. And then you could maybe add that up to an annual number. Reduced turnover. The more stable staff you have, the more stable your programming is. Increased lifespan of the property. All of those things, add numbers to them if you can. So that will really get you points on this question. Permits.
David,
So if better, oh yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to add, you said something
Please do.
very significant about the organizational sustainability. In terms of all of these questions where you're providing evidence to support that you've experienced negative economic impact, that there's impacts or improvements to organizational sustainability, as much as you can quantify these impacts, the better it is for your application. So we really have an understanding of how much and how significantly you've been impacted and whether what you're asking for is a remedy to that as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Permits. So if Better Tomorrow has to get permits for this project, you would list them here and the timeline needed to acquire them. So how long will it take to get approved? Any contingency plans, if it's denied, build that into it as well. We want to know that you know what it takes to undertake this project. And accompanying that is a plan set. Not everyone will have a plan set. If you look at the list of projects that will move forward, they are of varying complexities and sizes. Some will not require blueprints, some will. And sometimes to get a permit, you have to submit a plan set. So that's why we put it next to this plan set question is, so we know that if a plan set is required for a permit, you have them. We say here this will change this afternoon. If you answer yes, we'll be required to upload the plan set later in the application. We just put the upload right below it to make it easier for you all. If you don't have a plan set, just write NA in this field, but we will update the language on that. Timeline, another absolutely critical part of this application. The committee will be looking very closely at this timeline due to the fact there is a spending deadline of December 31st, 2026. So we want to know how the timeline was developed. So before we even go into the timeline, who you talked to, what planning took place to develop this timeline. Did you talk to an architect? Did you talk to a vendor for the specific modification that you're proposing? What took place for you to establish these dates? And then describe the dates. We turned on rich text editing, so you'll be able to use bullet points for this. That hopefully it'll make it answering it a little more streamlined. We're asking for specificity to the month. So even if it's the entire year, you can say January 2023 to December 2023, just to keep the committee's analysis across timelines uniform. We're asking for the month specificity. And then team leadership. Who's going to be overseeing this project? So there's 4 parts to this. Who will be overseeing it? What is their relationship to your organization? So are you maybe contracting a project manager? Are you what will they all be doing in this project, and whether or not they've overseen similar projects? Again, due to some of the high complexity of some of these proposals, we want to know that the people working on it will be able to successfully carry it out if approved. Rented property, if you answered yes to the property that you're to the question, is the property you are modifying rented? You've already answered why you're responsible for modifying it, and it was deemed sufficient by the letter of intent committee to at least move forward to the full proposal stage. We will also want to know who is your landlord, and then we want to see the lease. And if there are any circumstances around the lease, particularly around lease duration and potential for renewal, you would use this text box to describe it. These cost difference fields, again, copy from your LOI. If the project itself was more expensive than what you're requesting, here in your letter of intent, you would have described how you were covering those that cost differential. The written justification that we referenced before. This is going to be different for everyone. I already saw some questions in the chat about it. Jocelyn, did you have something to say about written justification?
Sure. I saw, let's see, Jerry, your question. David, do you want me to just go ahead and address that now?
Oh, no, I didn't know if you had something else to say about, or I can just go into the written justification.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
We need it.
Sorry, everyone. So again, this is required by US Treasury. When you go to the Treasury's like 200-page ruling on how to use ARPA funds, specific to capital expenditures are, if you spend $1 million or more on capital expenditures, you have to answer these questions. First, why is existing capital equipment not sufficient to address the harm? And why would additional funding to programs be insufficient? So in the case of Better Tomorrow, they have this building used for counseling. There's too many patients, and staff has complained about sharing offices with others, and that it's led to staff turnover. Besides just wages, it's led to staff turnover. So you could increase the wages, but there would still be shared offices, and you can't serve more patients in the existing building. There's not enough room. Comparison of alternatives. So they ask for 2 alternative capital purchases that could potentially alleviate the negative economic harm you've expressed. And they want to say, why is the one you're proposing superior? So in the case of Better Tomorrow, maybe they could go out and purchase a building and renovate it. That would probably be not cost efficient. It would probably just be cheaper to modify the building they're in, expand it, and do the necessary renovations rather than purchasing a whole new property and doing the same renovations they would have done on what they already own. Or they could propose a transition to telehealth, but they could explain maybe that's not sustainable with their clients. The clients don't have access to the technology or would not engage with it. You could cite past use of telehealth. Perhaps during the worst of the pandemic, when everyone was on telehealth, there was a drop in attendance. And then you would compare costs. So even though the telehealth might be cheaper, you could say it would not be most effective for programming. We're not asking you to go bid these out. You don't have to go bid out the alternative capital projects, but you will need some kind of cost estimation for what those would look like. And if you want to talk about efforts to already have done something else, perhaps you already went out and looked for a building, you can talk about that here as well, because you will also probably have better numbers as to why it's not cost effective. And again, these questions are direct from the Department of Treasury that we have to collect on request $1 million or greater. Dr. Reed, do you want to talk about community connection a bit? Oh, before you do, I will say the first few questions are locked because we don't think your headquarters will have changed, nor should the property have changed that you're modifying. But when it comes to QCT impact, Dr. Reed, do you want to talk a bit about that?
For QCTs, now this is looking at whether you're having an impact among residents who live in QCTs. So you've answered that question in your LOI. If you have more detail to add, you feel free to do that. If you have more detail about the services and of who's receiving the services, you feel free to update that. But I want to go to community representation. Can we move to that, David? So for community representation and connection, there are a few things that we're looking to really understand here. We want to know how your agency or your organization has historically been connected to the community that you're serving. We're not looking for plans that will create something new in a area where you haven't had any established connection or any established relationship. So that's one point to consider. What we're also looking to know is, how is your organization representative of the clientele that your organization seeks to serve, or the residents that your organization seeks to serve? So have you hired people from the community that you serve? Have you hired people that have similar demographic backgrounds to the clientele that you serve? We want to see information related to that here to show that you're connected and that you have representation that's similar to your community. And finally, I would also say that you want to make sure you are sharing any established connections to community-based organizations. If you have existing relationships with CBOs in the community that you can cite, list those connections here so we can see that you have established working relationships with other CBOs in the community. And I think all together, those things will show your representation and connection to the community you're serving.
Great. And then the leadership questions we have locked as well. If there's been a massive change in leadership, let us know. In general, that'd be good to know. But also for these demographic questions, if the people in those positions, the identities are different from what you've disclosed previously. Financial overview. So we are asking, as we've established this framework, if you submitted small capital purchases, we've established the same here, that if your project is under $75,000, you must upload 2 bids. If it is equal to or more than $75,000, you must upload 3 bids, and they should be dated after the start of this whole process, which was August 8th, 2022. Unlike on the small capital purchase side, we have separate upload fields for each one. Hopefully that makes things a little easier for everyone. If you have already selected a contractor and don't have bids to upload, you'll need to answer a question below thoroughly, such as, and there's 3 parts to it. So if you've selected a contractor, was there a competitive bid process? And that means were multiple bids collected in order to evaluate multiple possibilities? Describe this process. Who oversaw it? So what personnel members at your organization oversaw that? And have you executed a contract? If you haven't, you don't need to upload. You can describe the status of the contract, such as we have something, or we've just chosen this one and they're waiting on this funding. And if you have executed a contract, upload it. If you've selected a contractor, is it a small business enterprise, which is the county level's determination of a small. Nikki, could you give a definition of small business enterprise? Or Dr. Reed?
Sure. So an SBE is not race And it is race and gender neutral. So that's the difference with the MBE program and the SBE program. So we wanted to make sure that it was not specific to minority and women-owned, but the SBE piece encompasses all small businesses.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
And so if you know whether it's a SBE or a disadvantaged business enterprise or a minority and or women-owned business, you would select yes or no. And if you don't know, just put unknown. This isn't being scored. This is just for our data analysis purposes. That won't be considered as part of the application or by the committee. Related parties. So are any of the contract vendors that you've provided bids or estimates for a related party, such as a board member that maybe owns a construction company, or a relative of an executive team member? This isn't immediately disqualifying. It would come into play more when we establish payment schedules for any awarded contracts. It's not an immediate no, but it is something we want to know. A budget detail. Can you upload a clear and easily readable budget that breaks out costs for the project? It may be some of a repeat as for what is in your bid. However, we also want to see contingencies. We are asking for budgeting of 10 to 20% for contingencies and any performance and payment bonds for construction, if that is applicable to your organization. Also, if we are allowing a 5% indirect cost rate for this, for the administration of the grant and project overall, make sure to represent that in your budget. We have an example budget, but you are free to make your own. I would recommend it, if you do Excel, when you upload, make sure the cells do not go across multiple pages, that it is only vertically reading, even if it's multiple pages kind of down, it's not to the side. If you've ever seen a PDF of an Excel document and there's cells on multiple pages with no reference to what row they're in, we can help with that as well. So if you have trouble getting that budget into a clean PDF, let us know and we can help. Other funding sources. So this is copied from your LOI, whether you've sought funding for this project from other places, including CBDG or the TDC or foundation grants. This is where you would talk about any private sources of funding as well. Changes in operating costs, again, from the LOI, will it increase, decrease, or not affect operating costs? The most cost-effective proposals will be prioritized. Unless, of course, if there's an increase in operating costs, it will be fully covered and you have a sophisticated explanation of how it will be covered. That it's not kind of a pie in the sky explanation as to how you'll make up for the increased operational costs. Fund management capacity, how will you manage these funds and keep track of them appropriately on your general ledger and in its respective accounts? And then corrective and investigative action or grant recall. So we're asking if in the past 3 years, you've been under legal investigation by a local, state, or federal institution, been placed on a corrective action plan by a funder, or had grant funding recalled. Because of the complexity of some of the proposals in this pool, we want to know, are there any risks involved in the project? If you're under investigation, could that affect the execution of the project? If grant funding helps operate the program for which this capital asset would support, and there's a risk of that funding being pulled away, that's something the committee may take into consideration. This is not an automatic no. This is just for the committee's knowledge. And please make sure you talk about the current status of the incident, not just that it happened, but what is happening or what happened, for example, with the corrective action, or what was the result of the recall. Again, just for the committee to know. Run-of-the-mill documentation coming now, your organization budget in the format that your board approved it in, a board of directors list, your most recent 990. If you've gotten an extension on your 990 filing, make sure to note it, or we'll be following up with you. And then your most recent financial statements, if they're audited, attach the audit. If you don't have audited financial statements, again, you don't have to have audited financial statements for this process, but if you do, we'd like to see them. If you don't have an audit, just please explain why. We understand some organizations aren't big enough to have one, that's okay. Insurance. Duggan, are you around?
Yes, I'm here.
Could you talk a little bit about insurance coverage
Sure. And so primarily, the insurance coverage that we are going to want to see from organizations, because these are going to be most of these are probably going to be some form of construction project. For those that aren't, we might be able to talk a little bit about this, but really making sure that we have appropriate insurance, or you have appropriate insurance for liability and typical insurance coverages. But then we're also going to want to know information about insurance that you may have as part of the project cost for construction in progress, and other things like that. So list all of that here, or that, let us know and hear, that certain insurance coverages related to construction might be obtained, in the future as part of your, final work on accepting a bid on a project. But we'll want to see that information here. And then once awarded, we will work with organizations through the contract language to make sure that we have all the information that you need and we need related to insurance coverage. But I think one thing to certainly check on, we are going to ask that Pinellas Community Foundation be listed as additional insured on appropriate policies. Sometimes there's a cost for that, depending on your carrier, and so I would highly suggest that, usually it's a pretty nominal cost, but it's a cost that could, be connected with this project and paid for by this project funding. So you might want to inquire about that as part of your budgeting process. If you have questions about insurance coverage, you're welcome to reach out to our team and we can talk individually about what you might be thinking or what might have been advised to you. And we can work on that with you as well. And we'll get to specific questions about insurance sort of when we do Q&A, but then we can talk to you individually about what would be appropriate.
Great, thank you, Duggan. And then finally, post-grant requirements. We, once the county commission reviews recommendations and approves projects, you'll be required to submit a pre-award agreement within 2 weeks where you submit information relevant to contracting. Once a contract is issued, we are expecting a monthly expenditure report. So reporting will take place on a monthly basis until your contract is closed out and the project is complete. You are also able to upload something additional. There's not a ton of room file size wise for this, but you are welcome to upload any additional information you think could support your request. And then there is some small narrative space as well. And that is the application. So Rose, if you want to pop back up the PowerPoint.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to switch us back as I get the screen updated. Everyone take some deep breaths, going over a lot of good info to prepare you for the application process. Okay, so jumping back into some of the process pieces of this opportunity is payment. I will say, and at this point you've heard this before, but this process is designed on a reimbursement basis. But the direct caveat related to that is, especially with our large project applicants, in that award and contracting phase, it's going to become a conversation with the PCF team and your organization. And that is to determine what is an actual reasonable schedule, because as David mentioned, all of these projects vary in complexity and needs, and all of the organizations vary in their financial needs and resources. So when we get to this part of the process, we'll come up together with something that we can agree upon, and you will sign off on that in the contract. And then another resource that we've highlighted throughout this is there is a race equity loan fund opportunity that is a gift by the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg, which is available for some advanced payment options if that's not available to your organization. And if this is something that would be helpful to your organization, the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg coordinates and facilitates this process themselves. And we have a link on the ARPA landing page, which is www.pinellascf.org/ARPA, where you can find the link to apply for this opportunity. And Jocelyn will tell us a little bit more about the technical assistance opportunities coming up.
So we encourage you to sign up for a virtual TA session, which will be taking place with the team that you met at the beginning of this webinar. These will be 30-minute appointments. And what we suggest for you to get the most out of these is to have made some good progress on your application. So we found in the past that applicants who are pretty far along and can actually bring what they've written to us and discuss it and ask questions and actually have us read, some of it and give feedback, those applicants get the most out of these TA sessions. So that is what we recommend. We have scheduled them accordingly. So you have a couple of weeks before the first one. And those will be on November 18th and December 2nd. And I'm putting the link in the chat right now for you to sign up. You can also request one-on-one support with our team. Again, with any specific questions that either the TA, didn't answer that came up later, we will make sure to get responses back out to you. And again, these are our team members that you met at the beginning.
And just to add to that, that form lives on that webpage I just mentioned. So if you scroll to the bottom, you'll just type in your answers and submit the form, and that will route you to the best portion. And thank you for your engagement and participation. We love to open the floor to questions. I believe you can raise your hand. Also, we can pull up the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. Hey.
I'm going to go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to respond, Tess, to your question, because this is very quick and easy. The SBE, minority and women owned, will not affect your score. This is for our information. And if you haven't selected a contractor, that's fine. We are collecting this information just so that we have it as we move through the applications.
It will be a optional field. It's now optional, so that'll fix it too.
So I'm gonna read through the chat some of our questions, and then we can go from there. So this first one is from Jerry. So for their organization, they're asking for funding to offset inflation. I know how to say that word. Costs for a new construction affordable housing project. Not sure how to provide two alternatives to this project. Dr. Reed or Duggan, do you guys have any feedback on that?
Duggan will be back in a second. I'll admit that's a stumping one and something we might have to think through or come back to.
Yeah,
all right.
I can just maybe offer a couple of suggestions. So you're talking here about new construction. So I guess an alternative would be, instead of new, if you would propose purchasing existing buildings and sharing why that may not be the superior option. Or if you already have properties, which you may or may not, but if there's a renovation project that would be suggested for existing properties, that would be a couple of comparable options for that as suggestions.
Thank you, Dr. Reed.
And since we're here, Jerry, do you have any follow-up to that? Is that helpful to you? You're on mute if you're trying to speak, Jerry.
I can't, not.
Okay, there you go.
Hi. Actually, David kind of answered a little bit, and so I had scratched down, an example would be an alternative of perhaps purchasing and renovating a different building, but I still can't come up with a second possibility. But
Okay.
I think we,
Jerry,
go ahead, Justin.
another, again, pulling from the Treasury, narrative about this, you can also, suggest an alternative that would be maybe fewer units and why that wouldn't meet the needs. So it can also be kind of the scale of what you're proposing.
okay. We'll figure something out. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. And then the next question we're seeing is, will there be more detail available regarding the scoring of LOIs and the areas specifically where the application lost points? That's a great question. Right now, we've built into the process to give you specific comments from the committee to review for revisions to your application. But if you would like average scores, please send me an email and we're happy to provide that data to you. Next question.
And the feedback will be coming in a field at the top of your application. We didn't mention this. It will be a compilation of all the committee comments. And if you have questions about, we'll let you know when that field is live. And it takes some time to compile comments from across forms from multiple committee members. Once those are compiled, there will be a field that's locked and read only, but it has committee comments in there.
And David, I think it might have been said before, but for people to remember, the scoring for this process is starting fresh. And so that there will be some people that are part of the committee that previously reviewed and scored LOIs that are continuing on for this. But the scoring of this application is independent of the LOI and will be scored fresh.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Duggan. Next question brings us to the time frame to get bids. We typically will not get the bids from contractors until we have the scope of work from the architect. Architects are estimating 8 to 10 weeks to draw up plans. I would love to pass that. Duggan, you look like you might have an answer.
I think for some people, I will just be honest that the timeline is challenging. It's one reason that the time to complete the application was lengthened by another 30 days. I think we know that it's a challenge, but it's important for this in order to have a successful application. Those bids have to be received. And so if you have challenge with that, feel free to sort of speak with us on an individualized basis, and we can talk about where you are with that and whether or not it's possible for the application really to be successful overall.
Awesome, thank you. And I think you already got to test this question, Jocelyn. A required field is optional. And then the next question we have is, if the contractor is in kind, but the subcontractors are at a cost, is that where the bids come into play?
So I think in this case, it sounds like the contractor will be donating their services, which is a huge cost savings to the project. But then that contractor is going to have to show how the subcontractors that they're choosing in this case are the most cost-effective option. And so they may need to obtain multiple bids for pieces of the project that are going to be taking place. Just making sure that all that gets compiled as part of your as part of the application, and show that the due diligence was done to obtain those quotes and how the decisions were made to sort of compile your final bid from a contractor who's providing in-kind services.
Awesome, thank you. What amount of insurance do you want added for PCF? 1 million, 2 million?
So at least on general liability insurance for the moment, we'd look to be listed as additional insured on whatever it is that the organization holds as their coverage. And so we can talk individually about what your organization has as its general liability coverage when it comes to things like insurance for construction in progress. We can talk with you and you can obtain quotes from your insurance broker to figure out what the cost of that or what the appropriate amount of coverage there would be. Contractor may be able to help you out with that. So working with them and your insurance agent to figure out the appropriate coverages that you may need as a part of this. But really on the general liability side, we'll look to be listed as additional insured on whatever your policy limits are.
Awesome. The next question we have is, will the rubric be available on the website? Yes, that is coming soon, and we will let you know with an email update that has been published.
Our goal is by the end of the week. So it's coming, like when we say coming soon.
Yes. Thank you, David. Next question. What if the project is much farther along than the bid process and hiring a contractor? Bid process and hiring for this project was completed over a year ago, and it's currently under construction. Should we spend time reconstructing this process for the application, or should we share where we are? I was going to say, from my opinion, that it should definitely, the committee is going to want to know how those things were selected and the rationale, the justification of why you made those choices. And then it would be, critical to talk about how you're currently under construction and how that would relate to the timeline and the permits needed and your funding for the project.
I think to not reconstructing that process, but being very clear as to how you went through that process, what were the bids that were obtained, who bid on the project, who oversaw that as a competitive bidding process. You could cite, organizational policy. You may have policies that are that require you to obtain multiple bids. But I think really to help illustrate for the committee that you went through a comprehensive process to select a contractor and that it was a fair process. It gave you, and you were able to do your due diligence and really the rationale for selecting the contractor that you have ultimately decided to engage with.
Thank you, Duggan. And then, are there any sample justifications available for the written justification, and what elements are needed? Dr. Reed, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
We don't have any sample written examples of the written justification. The elements that are needed in the written justification are spelled out in the application. So one part of that is that we need to understand your negative economic impact, and that is a question in the application already. And then in addition, we want to understand why additional funds for programming are not sufficient to remedy how you've been negatively impacted. And then we'd also like you to share those 2 examples of how other options to remedy your impact are not sufficient or not superior to the proposal that you're requesting. So those elements are explained in the application. If you need extra assistance, we highly encourage you to sign up for one of the technical assistance sessions so we can have some one-on-one time.
And I think the not to make it overly complicated, but really to get to the heart of why this capital expenditure is the most appropriate option for remedying the economic harm. It reminds me a bit about rationale for having multiple bidders on a project, trying to do your due diligence and find the most cost appropriate option. In this case, why is this capital expenditure the most appropriate option? You couldn't remedy it in some other way, so you've got to make this purchase or do this construction project, but really to think about that as a written justification of appropriateness of this capital expenditure in comparison to other things. And I think it's really not, I don't think any of us are really going to get too hung up on, the format for that. Just make sure that it contains the elements that are asked for on the application, and everyone's may be a little bit different based on your circumstances. But why is this the most, why is this capital expenditure the most appropriate remedy to the challenges that are at hand?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Those are the questions in the chat. If anyone would like to raise their hand, if they had something else they wanted to discuss, get some clarity on.
While we're waiting for someone to raise their hand, there's one thing I wanted to go back and highlight from the question about the contractor being in kind. When you're submitting that, when you're explaining that they're in kind, I would highly suggest you explain what parts of the services they're providing are in kind, because we want to make sure the reviewers understand that there's not a disjointed process, but that everything that's a part of the process is contiguous and is clear and is outlined. So as much as you can, explain which portions are in kind, what services they're providing are in kind. And then so they can also evaluate the bids that you have and understand that the bids are covering the portions that are not in kind.
And I think, Dr. Reed, to add to that, also in whatever way you can to reasonably quantify what that in-kind expenditure is, so that it's viewed as a reasonable part of the project. So whatever rationale you use to be able to explain the costs that are covered by their in-kind contribution, and also be able to explain that it's an in-kind contribution from someone who has the skill to be that contractor. That it's not a cost-cutting option for the organization, but they're appropriately licensed, their history, and then be able in your budget to show what the value of that is, I think is very important too.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That brings us to, I believe, Zelda from the Florida Dream Center had their hand up first.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick question. A lot of what these specific questions are asking, we have in some form answered already. So is it okay to be duplicating our answers and just provide more information? I know, for instance, one of them was, why is it important to find funding for the building versus not? Well, because I couldn't find building at a reasonable cost at the time. So I'll be duplicating my answers throughout the application.
And that's okay, because what ultimately the written justification, ultimately we have to have that on file for our own audits and for possible submission to the Treasury if requested. That's the purpose of the written, it's okay to duplicate, especially with the written justification.
And I would just say with some other sections of the application, if it appears to be repeated, I would also just make sure that you're looking at, does it contain as specific of information as you can provide? And that is one piece that we did see through the letter of intent process, and we've seen in the other applications for small purchases, is sometimes there's an explanation, but it is not as clear as it could be. It doesn't have quantitative information. You could make it stronger with additional data points. And so I think that's important to look at in every segment of the application where you could be as specific as possible. I think of the community connection section of the application to not only provide your explanation, but then how do by if you're looking at comparatives to the community, how do you know that there is representation from the community? You could look at it by percent of a population of the board or percent of, you know, the staff that you hire comes from the immediate surrounding community to where your program is, you know, and you could give more specific data that would be helpful, and sort of drive home the point of some of these questions. And I think that will be a very differentiating thing in this application, is the more specific you can be in some segments to sort of drive home the point that you're trying to make and what the question is asking in a quantitative way, or with some kind of data point or points that will create a stronger answer. So I would just also, just as a backup to that, say if you're seeing repeat or you think it's repeat, go back and look and say, is this as specific as we could make it? Is it, you know, illustrating this exactly like we want to with numbers and data, or could we strengthen that?
Thank you. And then up next we have Sabine with a question.
Thank you, and apologies if you covered this and I missed it. The plans that we need to have for the application, is that a reimbursable expense or is that an expected investment to be made by the applicant?
That's a good question. I didn't think about it from that angle. I think we're gonna have to like drill into that and get an answer for everybody on that one, because everybody's at a different spot in this, and there are, you know, some projects require plans, some have plans already ready to go, and you know, they're at a different phase in the project. So I think that we're gonna have to sort of have some conversation about that and then provide guidance back out to everybody on that.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. Okay, I'm seeing another question. The site we found since the letter of intent will not require as much money as we requested. Early in this webinar, I was interrupted and I missed the info about changing the amount of the request. Could you repeat that? Yes, you can go ahead and just send me a direct email, Susan, especially because it sounds like it's going down. So that's a much easier thing to know and assess. Thank you for your question. Anyone else have anything? All right, up next we have Sandra.
Hi, you may have spoken to this. I just wanted to make sure, when you're asking about leadership team, does that refer to the contractors team or the members of our nonprofit who will be managing the project, or both?
For I would say, good question. It was mainly meant to be internal, in terms of who from the organization will be overseeing the administration of the grant and the
Okay.
subsequent project. Does everyone on the team agree with that? It was more internal. And it would be good to know who will be what team member will be dealing with the contractor, if there's a designated people or a team, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
Great. And we'll be sending out a recording of this in the next couple days, and we'll also post a link to it at the top of the application.
Thank you, David. I see another question popping up into the chat as well. An organization has had a change to their board, which reflects the communities they serve. You can send well, actually, you will have to update the board list anyway. And I think a good place to mention this would be perhaps in your community representation and connection field in the application. And then if you have any further questions, let us know and we'd be happy to address that.
And I would also mention this in the where you're checking off how your board, all the
Demographics.
diversity in your board from different racial, ethnic groups, LGBTQ, neurodivergent. That's
And they'll have
another
to reach
place.
out to,
Oh,
so
that's not-
you'll have to reach out and let us know which boxes to change. But we can do that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I think some of the takeaways are, if you have any trouble with the application, email me. We highly recommend and look forward to working with you at one of our virtual technical assistance sessions. Jocelyn put that link in the chat. It's also will be available on our website page. And then some general application tips when possible: quantify, quantify, quantify. And yeah, and don't feel that it's redundant to drive home your purpose and your impact. I think from a committee perspective, seeing that consistency and again, the specificity is only going to strengthen your application. And with that, we thank you so much for your engagement and your questions, and we are here to assist you during the application period. Thank you guys so much.
And can PCF people stay on?
Awesome. Will do.
We'll get Jocelyn back.